Welcome, everybody. How fun to catch up a little bit one-on-one and to see wonderful people connecting and reminiscing. Thank you so much for being here today to celebrate Dr. Mark Burford, class of '85. I had the pleasure of meeting Mark up in Portland a few years ago. Maybe it's like 5 or 6 now. We had a alumni event up in Portland that was really well attended. So let's not forget about that mighty, mighty city of who is the home of some wonderful UHS alums. I want to give Mariana some props at the moment to thank her for founding and being inspired to start the Alumni Honors Program in 2018. This was a brainchild of hers designed to recognize and acknowledge the contributions of alumni who embody our core values. About 7 years ago, we finally got to a point where we could agree on a handful of words that would guide us in perpetuity around important decisions and ways that we celebrated the school and the ways that we operated and held ourselves accountable. Those core values are inquiry, care, integrity, agency, and interconnection. And they have served us really well, both in good times and in hard times. You can imagine how they were guiding posts for us during this really challenging pandemic that is still going on. The recipients of the Alumni Honors are making important contributions at a local, national, and international level through personal accomplishment, professional achievement, and humanitarian service. Today, Mark will be in conversation with our very own Terrence Brewer, who is an instructor in the UHS music department. Terrence will introduce Mark shortly, but I'd love to tell you a little bit about the arts curriculum at UHS. One of the beautiful things about our school is that while the core remains the same and there's some evolution around the edge, everybody finds resonance in what we're doing yesterday, today, and hopefully in the future. The UHS arts program is designed essentially to fulfill two functions in the students' growth and development at UHS. The first is to develop an understanding of the richness of the arts, the contributions the arts has made in our world, and that continues to make to all of humankind. And the basic elements that are the foundation of the visual arts, music, and performing arts, the theater as well. The second function is to offer our students an opportunity to participate directly in the creative process through entry-level courses in each discipline, as well as through upper-level courses for those students who wish to pursue depth and mastery in a particular area. The foundation of a student's understanding of the arts is through our Western Civilization History of the Arts course. This is an interdisciplinary course, which is still required of our sophomores, and is taught by a team of teachers representing the fields of art, music, and cultural history. The history, cultural concepts, theories, elements, and facts presented in this course echoed in the studio and performing classes in the analysis of works through student projects designs is just a kind of lovely way that all of this braids together. And Terrence may seem sort of new on the stage, pardon the pun, because he's joined us as a full-time member of our faculty since 2018, but Terrence has been a part of the UHS arts community for a long while, in fact, 13 years, joining us full-time in 2018, as I said. He teaches jazz combo, jazz ensemble, music projects, and Western Civ. He is currently also the faculty rep to our steering committee, which is an important part of university's academic governance structure. Outside of UHS, put your seatbelts on, folks, because you're going to wonder how this guy has a moment to breathe. Outside of UHS, Terrence is an award-winning first call and in-demand band leader, record producer, concert performer, film score composer, and studio musician. He has produced and released 11 nationally acclaimed albums on his record label, Strong Brew Music. I'm wondering if that's coffee or beer, but I guess it doesn't really matter. Terrence sits on the board of directors of both the Independent School Musicians Alliance and the Museum of Jazz and Art in Oakland, and is past president of the Oakland Jazz Choir. He has performed 2 sold-out crowds at the Monterey Jazz Festival, Yoshi's, SF Jazz, Kumbwa, and venues around the world. I just have to say as well, Terrence is a beloved colleague, a good friend to all, and a really wonderful, wonderful addition to the UHS faculty in so many ways. So I'm going to turn the program over to Terrence so that he can introduce Mark.
Thank you for those kind words, Julia. I appreciate them tremendously. It's an honor to be part of the faculty here. It's an honor to be a part of the community. And it's a wonderful pleasure for me to be here with you and in conversation with Mark. A little bit about Mark here before we jump in. Mark's seminal book, Mahalia Jackson and the Black Gospel Field, is the product of an exceptional career of scholarship and teaching. And it's a fantastic book, by the way. The book has received multiple prizes, including the Otto Kinkeldy Award from the American Musicological Society, the top honor in his field. In addition to Mark's role as the R.P. Wallenberg Professor of Music at Reed College, he is the chair of the American Studies program and teaches critically important classes on comparative race and ethnicity studies. After his graduate studies at Columbia University in the early 2000s, focusing on 18th and 19th century Austro-German concert music, Mark was director of high school education programs at the Weill Music Institute at Carnegie Hall. Welcome, Mark, and thank you for joining us. I will say that just to give some context to the way this all sort of came about, Mariana had sent out the newsletter featuring the honorees for this year. And I saw Mark's photo there, and I read his bio. And I got really excited because, you know, those of us who like music history, like to study music history, think of ourselves as musicologists in one form or another, tend to like to connect with those folks. And so I saw it, I said, oh my goodness, graduate, you know, PhD scholar, musicology on the West Coast. I really want to try to get in conversation with him for my own personal goals, right? To talk about the things that the way that I approach music history and certainly the way that I approach music history in this very student-centered focus here at UHS and teaching the music portion of Western Civ. So I reached out to Mariana and I said, hey, I saw that Mark Burford, right, is being honored this year. And you know, I'd love to get his information just to get in contact with him to have a conversation with him. And she says, oh my goodness, I'm so glad you emailed me. I was just thinking of you. I would love for you to be in conversation with him at this alumni event. So this very kind of personal thing for me turned into a much more outward facing one, which I was really honored that she would think of me and think of us in being in that capacity. So that hopefully that sets the stage for this this conversation and just to give you some backstory and sort of understanding. And so Mark and I connected, we spoke on the phone, we had a wonderful conversation, and you know, I got his book and started to delve into it. And one of the first things I said to him when I got on the phone with him, and maybe this was even via email, is I said, you know, Mahalia Jackson. I mean, when I was growing up, I was born in Oklahoma City. My mom's family's from there. My dad's family's from Pittsburgh, California. I lived in Oklahoma City till I was 10 years old. And every Saturday morning was house cleaning in my house. And in most black houses that I knew, I grew up in a predominantly African-American area of Oklahoma City. And Mahalia Jackson was one of those artists who was always on the turntable, right? And so I was really excited to read this book and really excited to connect with Mark in that way. And as I moved to California and my grandparents out here, Mahalia Jackson was still on the turntable on Saturday morning. So it was I felt there was a little bit of synchronicity there. And so I'm really honored to be here. So Mark, can you just start out by telling us a little bit about your experience here at UHS, you know, music specifically, but, you know, in general, what your time was like here?
Sure. And first of all, thanks very much to everyone at UHS. I mean, it's a tremendous honor to be recognized in this way, very unexpected, and also the opportunity to reconnect with UHS. And to also think about what I do in a kind of broader context and kind of link it up with things I've done over the course of my life. Terrence and I, as he mentioned, had a great conversation. That he's in addition to a performer, also a music historian. So that's been really generative, kind of having our respective interests kind of interweave with each other. Yeah, and thinking about my UHS in the bigger picture, as I was thinking about this, one thing that struck me is how many things kind of accrued when I thought about my experience at UHS in relationship to what I'm doing now, and the real breadth and depth of my musical experience at UHS. So much so I had to kind of write it down when it started adding up. I mean, my main musical involvement at UHS was through Camerata, which was conducted by Bruce Lamont, and I'll say a little bit more about that later. But one thing I have no idea about Camerata these days, but that was really a golden era of singing at UHS. I was thinking about some of the people who were in Camerata at that time, Chris and Margaret Nomura and Helene Zadarzian and Harold Mann and Deke Sharon and Julie Hunt and Giorgio Culp and Robbie Stafford. I mean, these are people who kind of went on and kind of did stuff in music. So it was really remarkable to have that body of colleagues to work with. It was inspirational and kind of raised my game in a lot of ways too. Also, just the thing about Camerata was just the kinds of material that Bruce programmed. I remember, and this was actually, I mean, it was really a seminal moment for me. I remember we did a Brahms double choir motet. I don't know if you remember, Bruce, Opus 109, number 3. I remember, and where the chorus did sang one part and the Camerata sang another part, and that was just a remarkable experience for me. I mean, what high school students are doing double choir Brahms motets, but we did in Camerata. And I remember vividly in college when I was listening, I think on a Sony Walkman, to the recording of us having done that. There's a particular passage in the middle, and I mean, it sounds kind of silly now that I say it, but kind of sat bolt upright in bed and decided I just have to, if music can do that, I have to be a music major. It was but it stemmed directly from my experience of singing that piece with Camerata, and ultimately my dissertation was kind of connected to Brahms choral music. So that was actually, that experience at UHS is a direct through line to what I ended up doing later. But there are a lot of other opportunities at UHS that I had. I remember Chris Nomura, who I mentioned, who went on to be a kind of acclaimed baritone, went to Tufts. Tufts had a great a cappella group called the Beelzebubs, and they came to UHS and performed for us, and that just blew our minds. And Chris shared some of their repertory, so the men in Camerata sang some of those Beelzebubs arrangements. I remember there was a Supremes medley that we did at one of the choral concerts. Actually, it was influential for the whole field of a cappella, because Deke Sharon, one of my, he was the year below me, he went on, and that experience made him decide that he was going to dedicate his career to a cappella. Which all of us said there is no career in a cappella, but he made one and literally transformed. I mean, the field of a cappella right now is synonymous with the work of Deke Sharon, and that came from that experience at UHS. We also got really into, now maybe perhaps the nerdiest musical activity ever on earth is barbershop quartet singing. But Deke and I and Giorgio and Steve Kubik and other people got really into barbershop quartet singing at UHS. And in fact, I remember Bruce, it's his cross to bear, took us to, wait for it, the Society for the Preservation and Encouragement of Barbershop Quartet Singing in America local chapter meeting on his own time, took us there, Spebsqua, as it's known. And it was kind of ridiculous, but also the most awesome thing ever for a nerdy kid into barbershop quartet singing. But that opportunity, I remember writing some arrangements even for our quartet. So that experience, the Italy trip, which we took with the jazz band, Bruce and Frank Grijalva and Prudy took us. Bruce made me a TA for the chorus, and then so I was interested in conducting, gave me an opportunity to conduct the chorus, taking AP music theory. I didn't know what an AP test was at that time, but they had an AP music theory test, and even Western Civ. That was my first exposure to music history, what music history was. So, I had a lot of experiences with music at UHS. So, I mean, that would be one thing I would say. Other teachers at UHS that are really important, Sheila Lichtman and Carlton Tucker, just taking history with them. Jeff Worrell, actually, I remember him talking to me about a paper and kind of talking about this thing called syntax and writing. That was the first teacher I'd ever had who actually taught me that writing was not just a task to be executed, but actually was a skill to be cultivated. That was a really powerful moment for me. But overall, I would say Bruce is an extraordinarily impactful person in my life. And oftentimes you don't realize how impactful people are in your life till much, much later. But when I think about the various moments in my life, Bruce was also had his PhD in musicology as well. With a dissertation on Spiridion. You can ask him about Spiridion. But has been an extraordinarily it's hard to express how impactful it's been to be able to have had him as a teacher and now kind of be able to have more of a collegial and personal friendship with him now. So I'm really grateful for that experience to have had with him. The only other thing I'll say, just, I took a very circuitous route, frankly, I wasn't the most serious student at UHS when I was there, and kind of took breaks. I took a couple of years off during college. I took time between college and grad school. I took time after grad school and finally landed at Reed College. But I mean, the advice I give my students is, hang around the thing you love. I mean, if you're not sure what you want to do, I just kept on hanging around music, and eventually a job materialized that I could occupy. So, the both direct experiences and the more kind of circuitous experiences I've had since UHS kind of led to what I'm doing today.
I really appreciate that, Mark. There was so many wonderful things that you said in there. One of the through lines for me that continues to connect is this idea of this UHS community, number one, and the impact that we can have as teachers and as educators on students. And I had a very similar experience, in terms of high school and college teachers being immensely instrumental in me, pursuing the goals that I had and sort of changing various directions in my life. So I really appreciate you sharing that. And it is one of the things that is, I feel, is most often associated with UHS as someone who's come in, on this full-time level in the last few years, is the impact that folks like Bruce, Tim Price, long-standing teachers here have had on the students, and the way they look back on their experiences here, and the way that has then shaped them in so many ways. And as you mentioned, sometimes you don't recognize that until you're a little bit down the road from it, right? And you gain some perspective and the lens can change. But then to have that perspective and to be able to look back and really understand, in a deep way, how, those ripples, right, from the pebble in the pond, those ripples affected everything else in the remainder of your life. So I thought you stated that beautifully, and I loved hearing it. And it is the reason why I teach. And I'm sure it's the reason why so many of us out there who teach. And I hope that I can have that kind of impact on students, that I've had that kind of impact, and that I can have that kind of impact on students. So thank you for sharing that. Let's talk a little bit about, let's move into our discussion about the book and about Mahalia Jackson. And if you can, just sort of set the stage for me, where you were, how this book came about, What was the trajectory that led you there? And once you sort of set that up, maybe you can talk a little bit about the thesis of the book and sort of the overarching, messaging behind the book, or focus behind the book, I should say.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, again, I mean, in some ways it's a continuation of the theme of a kind of circuitous route. I my dissertation, typically in academia, you write a dissertation, your dissertation turns into your first book, you get tenure on your first book, and then you figure out what to do next. I was in some ways fortunate. I wrote my dissertation on Brahms and kind of his early career in the 1850s. But I think I enjoyed working on Brahms. I still teach him and his music. But I think I decided that it maybe wasn't a book that I'd wanted to work on. I was fortunate. I went to Reed College, where there wasn't the pressure. They allowed us to kind of take a more slow cooker approach to how we approached our research program. So I mined the book, the dissertation for articles, and did various, some parts of it I published as articles. But I always knew that I wanted to work on African American music. It was always something I did kind of that felt on the side, and eventually the periphery became the center. And so I started working originally on a book on the circulation of Black gospel voices in popular culture, of which Mahalia Jackson was going to be a part. But eventually, I found a trove of materials in an archive in New Orleans. And it was so rich, kind of what was going to be a chapter and then two chapters. I finally pressed pause on the project and decided I needed to write a whole book on Mahalia Jackson, focusing on this period in the 2 decades after World War II. And Terrence and I talked about this. It's remarkable that right now there is this kind of almost ritual memory of Mahalia Jackson. And I'll say a little bit about who she was in a second. There have been 7 musicals on her life. Currently in production, there are 3 biopics on Mahalia Jackson. One that just recently came out, produced by Robin Roberts for Lifetime. There's one that director Erica Nicole Malone, featuring Lettucey, is due to come out. Jamie Foxx and Queen Latifah are also producing a biopic on Mahalia Jackson, starring a neo soul singer, Jill Scott. So the question for me, kind of after writing the book, was why do people return to the life and career of Mahalia Jackson so much? So, I mean, I think there's a couple reasons. One, I think, is the fact that she is a kind of a quintessential African American story, an American story. She was born in 1911 in New Orleans. Her parents or her grandparents were born into slavery, so she's the grandchild of enslaved African Americans who were emancipated in central Louisiana, migrated to Louisiana. She eventually migrated to Chicago. So that kind of migration story from the rural South to the urban South, from the urban South to the urban North, kind of recreates a pattern for so many African American families. Grew up singing in the church, but was really immersed in the influences of New Orleans, from second line parades and jazz, Bessie Smith, just even, she talked about even street vendors and the kind of soundscape of New Orleans being really influential for her. When she migrates to Chicago, she's involved with the Greater Salem Baptist Church there, and it's kind of coming of age at a moment where modern gospel is starting to come into existence, and in Chicago. So she was kind of arrived at Chicago on the ground floor in a lot of ways. So I think one reason why she gets remembered so much is because of this family history and her history as an African American in the United States, and how that history is centered to American history. I think a second reason is, I think, the magnitude of her fame. She, from modest means, but eventually crossed over to popular culture after kind of working in church communities, Black church communities. She was raised Baptist, but eventually signed by Columbia Records and becomes an album artist and has her own TV show and her radio show. And we could talk more about her civil rights activism, but sings at the March on Washington. So she became really an iconic figure in a lot of ways, of both gospel, but I think of civil rights aspirations. So I think one of the theses of the book is this idea, this kind of tension between, she's known as the Queen of Gospel. Everything that's written on her kind of begins with that. But what does it mean to be both exemplary, to be the Queen of Gospel, to be kind of a stand-in for the entire field, and yet the magnitude of your fame kind of makes you exceptional? And I just find that really interesting. What does it mean to be both exemplary and exceptional within a particular field? So I think that's another thing that makes her unique, and it was something that I focused on. And lastly, I think also just the things that she means to others, the meanings that are made out of Mahalia Jackson as a kind of, as the gospel, as a kind of source for jazz, her religious fidelity and faith, and not crossing over to popular music, makes her a kind of exemplar of a particular religious authenticity. The idea of her being a kind of root source for Black vernacular culture, her iconicity as a civil rights figure. She was involved with politics and civil rights her whole career. So I think people like telling her story because she allows us to tell lots of stories, many of the stories that are important to us and the storytellers who have been drawn to her. So I think that was kind of how I got to the project, and some of the resonance that has reverberated beyond it.
And I think you do a fantastic job in the book, and an amazing job of illustrating that, of talking about storytelling a lot. You come back to that theme quite a bit in various ways, and really give a lot of nuance and depth to that idea. And while I do think there's more to that, right? There's an entire litany of examples, right, in my estimation, of, with Black American music, of these great stories, right? The great stories that have been told, and great stories that have yet to be told, right? Where's the Duke Ellington biopic? Where's the, et cetera, right? We could go on and on down that road, but I think you do a really great job. And for me, as I was reading the book, my brain was just firing off in all these really wonderful and amazing directions, because the book touches on so many, I think, very important topics and issues and things that are continually resurgent in African American culture and Black American culture. Not even Black American music culture, but Black American culture in general, in terms of the struggles and the things that we continue to go through, and seeing some of these cycles being repeated, and seeing some of these stories that are now kind of coming to the surface. Let's focus for a moment on one of the things you spoke about just now in your answer. You talked about this idea of transcendence, right? And going from gospel music to mainstream American pop culture. There's a couple quotes in the book that really sort of struck me along this line. One of them was, there's this quote of Black citizens being hungry for the respect and for equal opportunities to flourish. Jackson's success affirmed new forms of cultural recognition. Right, that's one of them. Right, and for me, that stood out. The other was this quote from Harry Belafonte, which said that Mahalia may be the single most powerful Black woman in the U.S. So can you speak a little bit about that idea of Mahalia Jackson specifically being transcendent from gospel into pop culture, and if you have any other thoughts in terms of Black American music in general, making that journey, right? You think of a Miles Davis, right? Someone who was immensely transcendent from just being a jazz artist to a cultural icon. So if you can speak a little bit about that, please.
Yeah, it's such a great question, because I think that I mean, I've often tried to flip that question, because I think on one hand, there are so many Black artists who have not been recognized, um, who have been obscured for various reasons, and for political reasons, for music industry reasons. But in some ways, with Mahalia Jackson, it kind of raises the question of um, hypervisibility. In other words, that Mahalia Jackson, the question with Mahalia Jackson is not that she's not seen. In fact, her visibility created real kind of raised stakes, I think, for African Americans. So in the 1950s, when she was first kind of being thrust into these very visible contexts that gospel singers, certainly, and gospel music and the sound of gospel music had not occupied before, there was a certain kind of anxiety in terms of how she would represent. I find this really interesting with her, that, uh, respectability politics, and the ways in which Black people and Black musicians were able to be represented in the public media. Jackson was, she was a Black Southern woman who was conventionally uneducated, conventionally didn't have musical training, although I push back on that a little bit, because if you're singing in churches 3 times a day, 4 days a week, you're getting training. But I think there was some anxiety in terms of how African Americans would be represented once they move beyond kind of local communal circumstances like the Black church to kind of more public visibility. So you see in some of the archival things I came across, some anxiety about that. And that Mahalia Jackson had anxiety about that herself, about kind of, well, I'm not formally trained. Well, I'm on this radio show and I'm self-conscious about how I speak, and those sorts of things. So I think the terms of visibility, not so much invisibility, but what are the terms under which Black people, Black music, Black bodies can be recognized in a public sphere. I think that's a really important thing that she brings to the fore, that those questions have real concrete stakes, for people. You could tell a story of African American popular culture just through how at kitchen table conversations kind of within Black communities, people have negotiated and brokered the terms of visibility once people are in mainstream context. So to me, that seems really important. And I think you're right. That's an ongoing question. I'd be curious to hear who you think are kind of interesting cases in terms of those kinds of Black visibility. But I think that the ways in which she raised that question of what does it mean to have Black vernacular culture circulating in quote unquote mainstream contexts, I think that has changed over time. I think that was an important moment in the 50s with her, but I think is still a contentious, but also potentially productive kind of question even today.
And this is why I wanted to speak with you, right? Because there's so many things in what you just said, that we could spend so much time on, right? There's the balancing act, and you speak about that in the book. You have this quote where you say, "The real life Jackson had to carefully negotiate historically situated anxieties of some African Americans that she might be perceived by white observers as fulfilling a stereotype," right? And there is the idea of stereotype. There is the continual idea, once you cross into mainstream popular American culture, from whatever is outside of, you know, the mainstream, this idea that you'll be stereotyped or pigeonholed, and certainly we can see that throughout the lineage of jazz in this country, blues, R&B, certainly moving into the hip hop age and era, right? You talk about black vernacular, right? And you speak to the idea, and I think about you know, myself as a child, sort of in a lot of ways of the hip hop era. You know, when I grew up in the music that was sort of being birthed into the world at that time, and what has been brought into mainstream popular American culture as a result of that genre of music in terms of the vernacular and this balancing act, right? And you also speak directly in the book about this idea of continuing with this idea of balance and complexity and nuance, right? When you talk about this idea of appreciation, right? Like real gospel that's not tainted by the world, right? But yet artists wanting to be justly compensated, but then how does that fame, what does fame and monetary compensation do to you as an artist, right? Does it, you know, legitimize you, or does it delegitimize you, right? Does it, and in different circles, depending on where you travel, that conversation is going to look a little bit different, right? In some circles it will give you more legitimacy, right? In some circles it will certainly push you aside. And there's this idea also of, you know, the sort of commodification of black music in general, but you speak very eloquently in the book to this idea of commodification of black religious music, right? But also at the same time, the people who perform this music really also seeking economic ambition, right? And people who promoted the music seeking economic ambition. And so there's this delicate balancing act, right, and this tightrope that's continually being walked, and we are distilling it down to Mahalia Jackson and the Black gospel field and Black American music in general. But you know, I make the argument that it can be certainly expanded, and this topic can be discussed in a myriad of different ways. But I'm going to switch gears, right? Because again, we can go down some of these lanes for a long time. But you spoke in your answer earlier, in your response earlier, about Mahalia Jackson and her activism, and her as a civil rights artist, as civil rights activist, and that speaks to a whole other question about artists as activists in general. And I would say that, you know, probably the most common way we see that expressed today in the African American community is with athletes, right? You think of Colin Kaepernick, right, taking a knee. You think of LeBron James. Anytime black artists speak out, black athletes speak out about politics, right? There's some kind of reaction, and there's very visceral and very deep reactions. But I want to go to this quote that you have in the book, where you talk about, and I love the fact that you start the book and you sort of you set it up by saying, why would I start a book about Mahalia Jackson, you know, talking about her time on the Ed Sullivan Show, right? But you give this really great in-depth, you know, account of leading up to that and all the different ways in which this was such a seminal and powerful moment, an important moment. But there's this quote that, and I believe it's attributed to Ed Sullivan, where he says that, you know, by having Mahalia Jackson and other you know, black artists on TV was bringing the fight into the living rooms of Americans' homes where public opinion is formed, right? That's a really powerful quote in a lot of ways. And so, can you please just, you know, give us some, you know, your thoughts around Mahalia as an activist, and what a quote like that means, what being on the Ed Sullivan Show meant, what, you know, singing at the marches meant, and all those various things, please.
Sure. Yeah, that's a really important part of her career, I think. I mean, just even folding in the previous question. I mean, on the one hand, and again, the terms of visibility, which I think, you know, the more I think about it, is kind of a central question. You know, on the one hand, Mahalia Jackson is held up as this kind of cultural icon for African Americans. You know, I'm not sure. I mean, if you know, we talked about this a little bit. I mean, if you ask a lot of white Americans who maybe of a certain generation, they would, because she was very visible. But certainly, my students have never heard of Mahalia Jackson. But you ask, you know, in most Black households, as you mentioned, in a lot of ways, she or her voice was an omnipresence. So even that aspect of visibility. So she has a kind of cultural resonance. But after her career from the mid 50s, afterwards, she kind of gets viewed as, Columbia is releasing material that's a little bit more produced in a certain kind of way. The kind of earlier Mahalia Jackson is kind of held up, but she kind of is viewed kind of skeptically by a generation of African Americans, precisely because of the kind of commercial questions that you mentioned, that somehow she drifted too far away from her base. So that's always, the idea of rootedness within a particular community, and how your material responds to kind of recognition in other contexts. So I think that, yet again, she's exemplary of that. But in terms of activism, it's interesting. There's Martin Luther King. She was very close to Martin Luther King. She was involved with politics, starting with being in local politics in Chicago and working on political campaigns. But when the civil rights movement kicked into gear in earnest in the mid 50s, she was very much involved. She was part of the Montgomery bus boycott, or went down to perform and lend her services. She was going to nonviolent training seminars in Birmingham, and was very much a financial supporter of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, King's civil rights organization. So they were very, very close friends. She's credited, I have to say, I'm sometimes a little bit skeptical about whether it's true or not, but it's anecdotally true, that she called out to Martin Luther King during his I Have a Dream, well, before it was going to be some other speech, and said, "Tell him about the dream, Martin," and he dramatically threw aside his paper and kind of went into the "I Have a Dream" portion of the speech. So she's credited with kind of having impact on that moment. Whether that's true or not, one of the things I found was a telegram that Martin Luther King wrote to Mahalia Jackson shortly after the March on Washington. And the final paragraph, he says, King writes, "Mahalia, you've been a blessing to me and the SCLC. You've been a blessing to Negroes who've learned through you not to be ashamed of their heritage," which I just find so powerful, that really that King is acknowledging that you, being a Black woman, an unapologetically Black woman, Black Southern woman, in public, on record, on TV, is just a model of how to negotiate that visibility in the national spotlight. So I think, just in terms of her work with political campaigns, her financial support of the SCLC, her own initiatives in terms of having fundraisers and forming a foundation of her own to raise money for civil rights. Also, as a businesswoman, she was a kind of intrepid and almost inveterate businesswoman, where she had a even before she hit big, she had a flower shop, she had a beauty salon. Later on, she opened a fried chicken franchise and was meant to kind of energize Black communities, and hiring and training people as entrepreneurs and in managerial skills. She was just, she was an admirer, and she kind of just was unapologetic about it, of the Nation of Islam, because she felt like their efforts at self-help were really what Black communities needed. So she's a reminder of the fluidity and the breadth of the political spectrum for African Americans, that she can be a supporter of Martin Luther King, and also recognize the political, the strategic value of the Nation of Islam self-help approach. So in some ways, the fact that she wasn't conventionally, that she was kind of unconventional in a certain sense, allowed her to have a kind of range of impacts from a civil rights standpoint.
Now, I love that response in so many ways, and I think that, when you spoke earlier about all of the myriad of books, plays, movies that are coming out, and you talk about storytelling, and you do a magnificent job of telling the story, and it's such a powerful one and such a deep one, and it has its, it has its foundations and its roots in so many parts of culture, of American culture in general. And then, and you speak a lot about this in the book, which is this idea of, negotiating our own identities, right? Like being very, committed to gospel music and the black religious music field, and being very devout, right? And also being someone who's on TV, being someone who's a part of popular, mainstream society. If you hear that, I have a student knocking on my door because I have class in 11 minutes. So I'm sure it's someone. So I'm sure it's someone who needs a read or something. So if you hear that, I'll just have to tell them to hold on a second. But if you can, there's a couple things that I have in my mind, but I know we're running into the last couple moments of this. Let me actually, I'll do this. I'm going to ask you, what do you want for us as an audience to take away from this conversation in terms of either Mahalia specifically? You touched on a lot of different things, the role of black women in music, right? The very out front role of black women in music, and how that's been a very different role than, the black man, the black male in music typically. You talked about politics, and we've talked about, art versus commerce and all these different things. What are some, kind of lasting thoughts that you want to leave us with? I think for me, one of the beautiful things about conversation and beautiful things about education is firing people up about something, right? Getting people inspired, right? If you want people to leave this Zoom call, this conversation, to be inspired in some way, what would that be? What does that look like to you?
I mean, one thing I often tell my students, and it's a kind of mantra in terms of how, I think of myself as a historian, a music historian, but a historian, is that, and I get, this is one of the kind of essential kind of tensions within academia between the historians and the kind of social scientists and kind of critical theorists. The historians are telling the theorists they're not historical enough, and the theorists are telling the historians they're not theoretical enough. And I think I probably, I guess I shoot down the middle, but I think I really value the historians' focus on specific cases. So what I often tell my students is, or remind my students, is that oftentimes the lives of individual people, and I would say not even oftentimes, almost always, are more complex than the stories we tell about them. So in some ways, we could use Mahalia Jackson to tell a story about Black music, this big category. And I think that's important. African-American music, Black music is a thing, and people value it. Black vernacular expression, Black cultural production, Black institutional building is a thing. And also using the lives of individuals to kind of disaggregate that thing, to think about, so for instance, we're talking about Black music, who counts in that? Are we talking about Charlie Parker? Are we talking about Charlie Pride? Are we talking about, Billie Holiday? Are we talking about Beyonce? Are we talking about Marian Anderson? Are we talking about Mary Lou Williams? Each of those people are a part of that thing, but also, who gets included, who, once we decide that there is this thing called, Black music, how do we both recognize that, but also not define people who are incredibly important outside of that? So I think that taking the time to account for what we're looking at when we look at whether it's Mahalia Jackson or whether it's Lizzo, what are we actually looking at, and not explaining people through categories that we kind of import externally. That's really important to me, because I feel like the things that I learned personally have been through just being attentive as possible to the details about individual people. So that's one thing I would come away with. The other thing I would say, just the importance of visibility. I think in doing this book, as an African-American musicologist, trust me, there aren't a million of us. But to do this subject matter and have the book be recognized, it's just incredibly, you know, just on a diversity front, the importance of seeing people doing stuff. And so the significance of people seeing Mahalia Jackson on TV at a time when Black people weren't on TV was significant. So the more opportunities we can have to allow people to be seen and be seen by others, even if they're not us, is really, really important.
Fantastic. And I, you know, just on a personal note, I hope that you and I can have more of these conversations, because I feel extremely inspired. I feel very fortunate, very blessed to have this conversation with you. And even in the short amount of time that you and I have spent communicating back and forth, either via email or on the phone, I have felt immensely inspired to continue to sharpen the lens in which I see music and music history, and the way I think about it, and the types of questions that I ask. So just know that you are also inspiring me, and I do appreciate that. There may be some questions. I'm going to put myself on mute and stop my video so I can answer the door in my office here to figure out who needs what, and I'll be right back with you. So maybe Mariana can handle those if there are questions.
Yeah, questions or just words of appreciation. If anyone wants to take themselves off mute, go ahead and say hi. I will say as a fan that one of the true joys of being the director of alumni engagement at UHS is making these kinds of connections. I just have such an incredible group of people to work with, both alums and current faculty and past faculty. I run a mini City Arts and Lectures program, and it is the most incredibly rewarding experience. And I just to be able to connect Mark and Terrence is really fun. And then to see everybody come out to support Mark. And then yesterday, our other honoree, Chris Raisbeck, has been really exciting.
Hi, this is Frank Wahalva. I wanted to say hello to a few people. Julia Eels, of course, my good friend and colleague, Bruce Lamont. So glad to see Harrison Pollock, the former student. And Mark Burford, I just want to tell a story about you, which I've kept for 40 years. I had Mark in AP Theory. I had an incredible AP Theory class, but I remember one of the things I made him do was write a paper. And Mark wrote a paper on Vedic chant. Now, I have to tell you, I knew nothing about Vedic chant, you know, and I thought maybe he made this up. Is this real? So then I started looking into it, but I mean, it just blew me away that, you know, he did something so way out of the field of music theory, at least AP Theory as I was teaching it. And anyway, it's great to see Molly Collins. Say hello to Dennis as well. And I understand, Terrence, you took over for Tim Price, is that right?
In a roundabout way, I'm sort of Tim and Bruce combined, because I'm running the jazz program, and I know, right? Look at Bruce's reaction over there. But I'm also teaching Western Civ, so I'm doing a bunch of different things.
Well, it's great to see you in that position. Tim Price took over for me and stayed 30 years, so yeah. You're only the third jazz director, so now we're a team.
And crossing those fingers, we'll have a long run here as well. I'm really honored to be a part of the community, and I love the opportunity to serve these students and to serve this school.
Well, I'm so pleased at how the jazz program has survived and thrived from its inception. When Dennis hired me to go there to University High. So anyway, I'll let other people talk. Wonderful to see you all.
Great seeing you, Frank.
I would like to thank Bruce for nominating Mark for this award. That was an incredible email to get months ago, and I need those tips. And Bruce, thank you so much for letting me know about Mark's book and his recent accomplishments. Well, I mean, he's incredibly accomplished, but about the awards specifically, that was really amazing. Thank you.
Nobody will believe me when I say I did not prompt Mark's incredible paean to his experience at UHS I didn't ask him to do that. He won all this on his own, and I'm just thrilled. A number of your classmates have messaged me as well, some who sang in that Brahms motet. So it's had its effects.
Well, I need to fulfill my contractual duty to go teach sixth period jazz ensemble at this time. It's been an honor for me to be in conversation here, and wonderful to hear these stories about this community and UHS through the years. One of the things I love about this place is the institutional memory that exists here through alums and teachers who have been around for a long time. So I appreciate it, and I thank you, Mariana, for having me, and certainly
Thank
Mark.
you.
It was my pleasure.
Thank you, Terrence, and thank you, Mark. And we are at, we're just about at 1:15, and I know this is a business day, so if anybody needs to roll off and go back to work, I totally understand. But if people would like to stay and chat, I can keep the video open for a little longer. And thank you all for coming. I think that's it for me.
Hey, Mark, what's going on?
Hey, Mond, how are you?
Good. I'm working my way through the book, and I just get this image of you sitting in a warehouse with all these documents and boiling it all down to this one book. You know, did anything at your town school, UHS, you know, upbringing allow you to cipher through all that to create a work of art?
Well, it was nicer than a warehouse because it was this library in New Orleans. And I have to say, I always think of you when I think of New Orleans, because my very first trip to New Orleans was when I was driving across country and we met up in New Orleans. So all my tips of where to go in New Orleans came from you. So I have close associations of being there. But yeah, I mean, just doing, you know, I think the writing, I mean, that's a really important thing to me now as just a teacher, just kind of teaching students how not to write college papers, but how to become writers, and thinking about that really started at UHS for sure. I felt like I showed up at college already kind of with that kind of thinking in place. So definitely paid off.
It's a massive amount of material you had to go through.
Yeah, but it was a pleasure. If that's your day job, you should consider yourself sitting in coffee shops listening to Mahalia Jackson. Another day in the coal mine.
Yeah, it's an excellent book.
I'm curious as to why you chose UC Santa Barbara for your undergraduate. Is it because of their music program?
It's a good question. It may have chosen me. I think I wanted to stay on the West Coast. I didn't know much about their music program. But honestly, funny thing about college is that I didn't expect to be a music major. I mean, that's what I meant when I was saying hanging around it. I think I, on my application, put biological science and economics, which now seems like science fiction, that I would actually imagine that I would want to do such a thing. And just kind of the AP music course, I passed out of a year with the AP music theory exam. So I kind of had a leg up on music, and I just kind of kept on taking courses. And by my sophomore year, I realized that, you know, that's what I wanted to do. So really, I didn't go there knowing I was going to be a music major, now that you mention it.
Hey, Mark, Jen Siegel,
Hey, Jen.
colleague from UHS. I'm curious about whether I'm sorry, I'm just learning about all of your work now, but have you continued also singing along with this historical writing?
Not as much. I mean, when I first went to grad school, I was singing in an early music a group there really throughout grad school. But really, I kind of in grad school made the decisive and at Reed, you know, I helped out with the chorus and sang with the chorus there a little bit. But I kind of made, when I went to grad school, a decisive shift to go, you know, from performance to kind of more scholarship, though.
Yeah, and what prompted that? What in your life made it feel like you wanted to study about it rather than sing?
Yeah, I guess I didn't, in college I did a lot, but I just think I really kind of fell in love with, right. I mean, another thing I should say is that I had no idea what musicology was, or even what academia was, when I went to college. I mean, I was in college, I left school, I went back, and a scholar that Bruce will know, Alejandro Planchart, was my music history teacher, and wrote on a paper and just said, you should consider musicological scholarship. So I went to his office and said, what's musicological scholarship that I should consider? And realized that there was a thing called grad school you can go to, and realized, wow, you can actually write about music and study it in that way. So that was actually a really pivotal moment. So all your teachers, make sure when you write comments on papers, you could be determining what people do for the rest of their lives.
Yeah, absolutely, because we don't always know what's available. And yeah, that kind of moment can be hugely pivotal.
Definitely.
I wish I'd had more of those moments myself. I've been a little lost career-wise, and I'm in grad school for public policy right now, and just am slogging my way through a research paper and realizing how little I really understood about academic research until now, and I'm in my 50s, so nice to see you.
You too.
One other question: what is Harold Mann doing these days? He was like one of
Bruce
my
could
heroes.
probably answer that question. Computers, right, Bruce? He and his brother, I think, are in business together.
Yeah, he and Alex have had Mann Consulting. They got in on the ground floor of computing, and these two brothers have managed not to kill each other. They are the best of friends, and he's a great success in the computer management. It's not the get rich quick software kind of thing, but they're doing real well. He has two kids, and
Has he continued doing music?
not, continuing doing music is kind of an interesting thing. I have retired from everything I'm doing, and for the first time in my life, I'm enjoying playing the piano for pleasure, not work.
Yeah.
And there's absolutely no reason, financial or otherwise, that I would keep doing this. And finally, I get the chance. So I'm sure he's doing music, and you don't want necessarily to make the thing you love
Right.
the thing that you earn your living with.
Louise put in the chat that I guess Harold's in Marin as well too. So.
Yes. I see Juliet there too. Louise was singing in that famous Brahms motet that you mentioned. And
Okay, I wasn't in
trying to
Camerata.
remember.
I never got to be in Camerata. I was only a chorus girl, but I did all 4 years in chorus. I loved it. It was therapy for me, that whole 4 years.
Well, and it was a double chorus piece. So
I was in chorus, and I must have sung it, and I yet don't remember, which is very sad. But I remember lots of other things that were impactful.
Mark, you didn't say anything about your American study. You do a lot at Reed that is not music based, don't you?
Yeah, I think because my courses tend to be historical, like a few of my courses are cross-listed in history department. So cross-listed in history or cross-listed in race and ethnic studies. But the American Studies program is something that's important as well too, just kind of connecting with Americanists. So it's I've enjoyed it because it allows me to kind of be kind of interdisciplinary in the way I'm kind of part of the campus community, and bring in guests that aren't necessarily music people. So that's been that's been really great as well too, going to American Studies conferences as well too. So I see myself as an Americanist musicologist, if there's in that way too.
And you were the leader of a youth chorus in New York, right? What was it like being on the other side? as a,
I don't think, oh, no, I didn't do a youth chorus, but when I was at Carnegie Hall, after grad school,
That's
before
what
I
I meant.
went, yeah, there was a National High School Choral Festival that I did at Carnegie. And that was great. I really, really enjoyed that a lot too. That was good experience, kind of getting outside of academia for 3 years before I got back. It's like hopping in the sauna before you jump back in the pool or something like that. So that was a really good experience, just working at, and just see and realizing too that Carnegie Hall, what an incredible experience, but it's also a different kind of way of being in the music biz, and I realized that academia was more kind of what I wanted to do, so it helped me kind of get that experience but also reaffirm what I actually wanted to do.
Cool.
Mark, what's your next book going to be on?
Yeah, I'm on a sabbatical. That's a good question. I'm on sabbatical next year, and I'm starting, I think, 2 projects. We'll see which one wins out, but a book on W.B. Du Bois and music. I'm just kind of thinking about, people focus on the souls of Black folk, but he lived 95 years, the African-American sociologist and philosopher and historian. But he wrote a lot about music and thought a lot about music and was committed to music. So a book kind of on that. But I also am thinking more about what different kinds of audiences to write for other than academic audiences. So I'm really interested in doing a book on the Rolling Stones and African-American music, kind of written more for a general audience and doing research. So I'll start research on both of those things during my there's just so many plot lines in the Stones career where they're connecting with African-American music, from cover songs to backup singers to Billy Preston to interested in blues so I'll start work on those and then see where I am at the end of the year and where I want to continue my momentum.
All right, I'll carry your suitcase down to Memphis for you.
You gotta help me with that Rolling Stones research, Monty.
Yeah, I'll help.
Mark, my son is a really amazing singer, and he's about to do his 7th and 8th grade years. He's been singing with a after-school choir at the Pacific Boy Choir Academy in Oakland, and now he's going to go there full time for the next couple of years.
Oh, great!
What advice would you give him about getting the most out of his music education?
Boy, I don't know if I have any advice, but I will say that, I was in the San Francisco Boys Chorus. That was my training. That's really why I got interested in music. And I think the ear training, musicianship stuff that I got, that has never not been helpful. I mean, just kind of so you never lose your that part of it. So I think that the singing and the vocal training is super important, but even after I've stopped singing, just as a teacher, the musicianship and ear training part of it has been essential. So I would encourage him to not skimp on, not to sleep on that part of things.
Okay, thanks.
For sure. Yeah. Okay, bye. I actually have to meet a student myself at 1:30, so I should probably make sure I don't.
Okay, thank you so much, Mark. It was an honor for you to, well, it's an honor that you accepted our award and to see you today and learn from you. And I'll be in touch about the article in the magazine this summer.
Thanks very much for all your work on this, Marianne. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for coming, everybody.
Thanks everyone for coming. It's great to see everybody.
Mark, bye-bye.
All right.
Bye, Mark.
Bye, Kay.